Hey guys, it's difficult. I do not want to start any more videos with hey guys.
Right.
That's how Unnatural Vegan starts her videos. Fuck that.
Yeah.
I've got to ban the saying.
Partly why people thought that the video that I recorded was a natural being because it started.
Oh yeah. Oh god. So what are we supposed to say?
I don't know.
What is up? Isn't that what Spheerage said?
Good evening.
Okay.
Welcome to the above.
Best wishes to you and yours as you join me for this YouTube video. All right, we'll come up with something. Get the marketing committee to work on a new greeting. Or what? Should I just open with à-bas-le-ciel? No, it was à-bas-le-ciel.
À-bas-le-ciel.
All right. Okay. I remember I once heard an interview with a guy who was part of 50 Cent's crew, the rapper 50 Cent, when they came up with his background ditty, G-Unit, that they actually had a brainstorming session where they sat around trying to come up with that. All right. Enough of a digression from a digression. Guys, this video is about something that means an awful lot to, I think, a small number of people. But it's very difficult for me to say how many or how few people this matters to. Over the internet, over the last 5 years, I have several times spoken to people who deeply, passionately believe that there is no such thing as free will, that there is no such thing as human beings making arbitrary choices or creative choices, that all choices human beings make are determined. So these are hard determinists. And from my perspective, for them, it really is a religion. Now, why do I consider this a religious view? Well, for one thing, it is very directly parallel to religious determinism. So a simple Christian form of determinism would be the view of the world that although you may imagine you make decisions, although you may imagine you make choices, although you may sometimes regret looking back at your life that you made the wrong choice, secretly and unknown to you, as the myth goes, all of those decisions were part of a mysterious plan, the Christian God's plan. In fact, those decisions were, in a sense, not of your free choice, not of your election, not of your free will. Now, scientific or scientistic determinism sees the world in this same way, but it has replaced the role of the Christian God with a variety of demons and fairies. Some of them put emphasis on genetics, on DNA. Some of them put emphasis on psychology, brain states and brain scans and brain activity. Some put emphasis on a very metaphysical reading of a chain of causes and events that extend around the whole world around us, like the butterfly flapping its wings, the idea that some trivial cause can indirectly have a cascading set of knock-on effects, some of which we may be aware of and some of them not, but nevertheless, each of us is ultimately like a tornado that perceives itself as making decisions, but really does not exist as an entity that makes decisions at all, but is merely the product of unthinking circumstance swirling around it, and then at some point we come to see that swirling within ourselves as if it were our very selves. Now, the religious form of pious, God-fearing determinism is also psychologically similar to scientistic determinism in that it allows them to have a very pious view of sinners. If you really believe this as a Christian, then you feel nothing but pity for the rapist or murderer because you see them ultimately as a kind of victim of circumstances, or even as a victim of a divine joke of God's plan, that in some very real sense, they didn't have a choice, or it was not their choice, or it was not their fault. Although, of course, in another sense, there is nobody else to blame. Now, in this same way, I've just now been engaged in a debate with people who very piously and passionately believe in this view of determinism. And they really do argue, they have really passionately said to me that they do not regard rapists as being guilty of rape, and they do not regard murderers as being guilty of murder, not in the same way I do, because they absolutely insist that each and every one of those criminals was behaving under duress, in effect. They were making those decisions as if they were compelled to by outside forces that determine everything. So again, these outside forces, whether they are genetic, evolutionary, socioeconomic, myriad, whether they are tiny and trivial, like a butterfly flapping its wings, or something abstract and transcendental and inevitable, they add up to a worldview that is magical and tantamount to monotheism. It's equivalent in its outcomes and in the faith it demands of the believer. Now, what I pointed out to these people repeatedly in the debate was that, oh great, somehow that tiny bump distracted. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay. I pointed out to them that what it is they believe in here has no empirical basis whatsoever and would not pass Karl Popper's test for falsifiability. So I'm not going to digress into a long lecture here about Karl Popper and the philosophy of science and what falsifiability means. But the idea is to challenge a view like this by saying, okay, what elements of your view can be observed empirically in real life? And of course, with many theories of this, including psychological theories, even if it's purely psychological, not metaphysical in any way, if it's just a claim made about people's mental states, intentions, and emotions and decisions, ultimately, I'm going to challenge you to explain to me something you could empirically observe, something hypothetically you could observe, where if it were true, if it happened, you would then accept that your explanation of reality is wrong. So the textbook example Karl Popper gives of this is the belief that light always travels in a straight line. And there was a counter theory proposed, I believe by Albert Einstein himself, that actually at a certain stage of the moon obscuring the light of the sun, you should be able to measure that the moon does actually, the gravity, the gravitic force of the moon actually does intercept and slightly bend off course the rays of light that pass right next to the moon, very close to the moon. And this was tested, and lo and behold, it proved to be true. So the point is, the theory was originally, one theory was light always travels in a straight line, and the other theory was if there is a sufficiently heavy object, not just some object that's sitting on this table here next to me, but something with enough gravitic force would actually result in light bending in its course, and it turns out that was right. But we have to be willing to state our theories in a form where we can admit of an empirical challenge. Now, in the discussion I just had, ultimately, what they retreated to was a position that their explanation of the world has no empirical basis, that it has no pragmatic value. Because I said to them also, well, if your theory is true, what problems does it solve? Whether a theory is philosophical or mathematical or one of physics, even in the social sciences, a theory has to have a problem-solving value. It has to elucidate something rather than merely obfuscate something. What is the problem this solves? Great. So I lose my train of thought twice. It's not you. It was the cooker going off for whatever reason. Oh, well, I'm a little bit run down, a little bit sick today. Had a great workout at the gym, though. Okay. End of digression. It has to have problem-solving value. It has to elucidate something. And it has to be falsifiable, right? And in their case, they retreated to a position of saying, no, their view of the world was purely a sort of qualitative description of how cognition works, that there's nothing empirical about it, there's nothing falsifiable about it, there's nothing that can be tested. There's nothing that could either prove or disprove it. So I said to them ultimately, look, from my perspective, your view of the world is magical. When you walk through the forest, you see fairies everywhere. Everywhere that there's darkness and shadow, you can imagine that these magical forces you believe in are active. In the same way, a monotheist who believes in theological determinism walks around the world and everywhere sees God's plan. If someone who believes in God's plan wishes it would rain, and then instead of raining, there's a terrible flood or there's a tsunami, they'll believe it's God's plan either way. If there's a drought, they say the drought was God's plan. If all their crops are destroyed because there's no rain at all, they say that was God's plan. Instead, there's too much rain. Well, it turns out that was God's plan. They will rationalize and reinterpret whatever happens to affirm their deterministic worldview. And these scientistic, non-monotheistic believers in determinism, they're just as religious. They are believers still. but they believe in a plurality of fairies, some of them putting more emphasis on DNA, some of them more on other factors. And as they walk through the world, they see those spooks everywhere. They see those fairies and demons. They feel their own hypothesis being affirmed again and again. Now, how did the conversation, there was a debate, several people participated. I was the only person on my side of the debate. How did this conclude? So very interestingly, my final opponent, because I talked to several people who exhausted themselves, the last fellow at bat, the last fellow on the microphone, he used an example that you might think I had cornered him into, but he volunteered it. He spoke at some length about how he regards a rapist as ultimately not responsible for their commission of rape, because from his perspective, a criminal like that never had an alternative. They never had an alternate course of action that you can reproach them for failing to take. And I said, okay, so that's your perspective. That's your magical religious view of what happened. My view is instead compatible with basically the legal tradition and political tradition of every culture I've heard of on planet Earth for the last 2,500 years, 3,000 years. I simply do think that, yes, people who commit crimes choose to commit crimes and so on. So, okay, so I'll give you a counterexample. What's problematic from my perspective is that you can't really elucidate what's happening when a human being sits down at a blank canvas and tries to paint a painting. This is very different from a criminal act. There are a series of creative and arbitrary decisions being made by the painter here. And when he's done the painting, maybe his teacher tells him, you know what, this is a really lousy painting. And maybe the teacher discusses with him in what ways it's a lousy painting and why it's a lousy painting, which techniques he had neglected to practice, or which decisions he made, which creative choices he made. Oh, you chose to paint the sky blue, and it would be better if the sky were red because you need this These are the types of decisions you make in painting something. And in talking through those decisions and talking through what skills he has and what skills he lacks and so on, the painter may be filled with a sense of regret and remorse. And indeed, he regrets painting a bad painting because he feels that he could have painted a better painting. And what do you know? The next time he sits down at a blank canvas, he makes different choices and he tries to make a better painting again. From my perspective, there's no mystery to be explained here. There's no metaphysical problem or a priori conflict to be resolved. There's nothing difficult for philosophy to exchange. But from their perspective, the painter is wrong to regret having painted a bad painting because he had no choice. There was absolutely no alternative. All along, the only painting he could have possibly painted was this terrible painting. And that may be a very pious and very reassuring and very kind and very nice thing to say. And from my perspective, it's complete nonsense. I can't imagine what motivates it. It has absolutely no pragmatic value as a philosophy or as a political philosophy. It's not going to help you solve any problems or improve society. So fundamentally, I do not know why they bother. The only other thing I'd mention in this video, wrapping it up, is there was a real contrast in the selection of examples that the two sides used. My examples are very directly and simply drawn from reality, like painting a painting. Who makes the creative decisions? Where does that come from? How does that proceed? Why would this deterministic worldview help you with this? I mean, do you really believe it is God's plan or the plan of some plurality of demons and fairies that this painting has to turn out one way and one way only, as opposed to being something each of us has control over, arbitrary control, creative control, ex nihilo control, but ultimately a kind of meaningless control also, control that, I mean, it doesn't reflect your genetics or any other great transcendental paranormal abstraction. You're just going to sit down and try to come up with an idea and do the best you can. So my examples were very close to real life experience we can all relate to. And their examples relied on huge leaps of inference that I found laughable. One fellow was insisting again and again that a human being is no different from a computer playing chess. It was striking to me that he insisted again and again that a computer playing chess, that's the product ultimately of human beings programming instructions, etc., is literally, he used the word literally again and again, the same as a human mind thinking. Now, I do have a little bit of experience with computer programming. I studied it in school when I was a child, basically. And I tried to talk him through to what extent these two things are really profoundly dissimilar. And they're dissimilar in ways that matter for the argument that he's making. A human mind is very, very different from a computer code running off of a hard drive. It's very different even from the particular type of programming he's describing, where you have a quote-unquote evolutionary process producing the chess-playing computer, but the word evolution is being used here in a sense that has nothing to do with natural selection, with wild animals competing for who gets to mate, that the nature of the human brain is really not comparable to a set of instructions written in a computer programming language like C++ or assembly code or what have you, that in fact the allegory he's using in many ways damns his own philosophical case. It requires really a religious level of faith and very creative leaps of inference to possibly believe that a computer playing chess following a code is any way similar to the decisions we make when we sit down at a blank canvas, decide what it is we're going to draw, and then how it is that we're going to draw it. So there you go, guys. This is a philosophy that seems to be popular amongst vegan intellectuals who spend a lot of time on the internet in 2018. I don't know if this will become a really kind of trivial footnote in modern Western history, or if this is going to go on to be the next big thing like blue jeans. I could see it going either way, because, I do think that these people have an understandable motive. I think that they want to have a view of the world that is fundamentally compassionate, and that looks at people who are raised in poverty, mired in bad circumstances, and making bad decisions as not being culpable for those decisions. And I'm sure that their heart is in the right place, and I'm sure that just as religious people who believe in God's plan draw a sense of faith and moral courage and positive motivation from seeing the world that way, I think they probably do get a kind of warm and fuzzy, compassionate glow in believing, if not quite like Spinoza's concept, if not quite believing that they live in the best of all possible worlds, that they live in a world where, no matter how terrible, it was the only possible world, and that any given person is 100% a product of their circumstances and their genetics and these mysterious forces that surround them that are beyond their control, that in fact nothing is under your control, that nothing is ultimately your fault. What a liberating delusion that must be.
À-bas-le-ciel.